Okay, welcome very much in the audience. Welcome very much to Conversation. A pleasure to welcome truly a dear and a friend of mine, that being Dr. Sidney Greenfield, Ph.D. He's a emeritus professor out of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and we're dear friends. We've done a number of programs. He's brilliant. He's very interested in a lot of different subjects. And we're going to talk with him today about, we're going to lead in, or give him a chance to lead in, to a book of his that's being reissued, I guess. And it's called English Rustics in Black Skin, A Story of Modern Family Forms in a Pre-Industrial Society. I'm going to hand it up. You can let them see what that looks like. Okay. But why don't you introduce yourself, Sidney, and we'll get off. We'll be talking about this book and other matters, but welcome so much. Okay.
Thank you, Harold. It's a pleasure to be back. And as you introduced, I spent 34 years of my life in Wisconsin, and we know what's going on in Wisconsin.
Yes.
And I want to relate that to the Middle East and to the book, because you see, this is a book that's out of print that is being republished by the Barbados Museum and Historical Society.
Okay, good.
And I'm going down there for a book launching next week, which I'm delighted about. But this is a study that I did in the 1950s.
Okay.
And
goes way
I want to
back,
show you that what happened in Barbados and what's in the book is very relevant for what is happening today throughout the North Africa, the Middle East, Wisconsin, Ohio. These are events that all tie together because the book...
One thing I want to say is you tied North Africa, Tunisia, and Wisconsin. Do you begin to see them related in the same way? That's something I just say off the top, or just have thinking about that?
No, what I want to do is show you, start off with the book, because what it is about is the family life of people in the island of Barbados in the mid-1950s, where people were living in a world of dependency on wage labor, where jobs were scarce, there was tremendous competition, and as a result, an awful lot of poverty. And what the book describes is what daily life is like for people caught in those circumstances.
And
the circumstances, of course, are being dependent on wages where there aren't enough jobs for people. Okay, let me set that out and take it back for a moment and look at what is happening today across the Middle East with all of the protests and reactions that are overthrowing governments, and begin to look at what seems to be a general worldwide picture of people being dissatisfied, being unhappy about the world they're living in, and beginning to take action to do something about it. And even though the media tends to report the great democracy movements going on across North Africa and into Yemen and other places in the Middle East, what very often gets left out is the fact that these people who are protesting are, to a very considerable degree, young and educated. And they many of them are, many of the leaders, if you take Egypt, for example, it was very clear that you had people who, and what has to be pointed out is that in these countries, populations are very young.
Yes, indeed. They had
you have large numbers of young people, and there are no economic opportunities for them. What we've had are governments that are not only authoritarian, but they have dominated the economic machinery, so there really aren't opportunities for anybody but their own cronies in the power structure. And this is all part of the dissatisfaction that people are expressing by overthrowing the government. We emphasize the desire for democracy, but if you stop to ask, what do people want? What do they mean? What's the vision they have of a future? And I want to suggest that this vision of the future is something that they got very significantly from the United States through television, through movies, through books. And what it was a description of life in the United States that's about a decade old that focused on the lives of middle-class people.
Okay.
These.
What's the decade old? I'm sorry.
The decade old from today.
Oh, today, not from when you wrote the book.
Going back from today.
Okay.
That when between the 1960s and the 1980s, American movies and American television showed Americans to people all over the world, and to their great surprise, the people shown lived what we call a middle-class life. Which is, they weren't very, very rich, they weren't desperately poor, but they were able to own homes, they were able to own cars, they were able to own all kinds of material goods that weren't available to other people in many other parts of the world.
Let me ask you another question, or another question. You're talking about America, it's characteristic of Europe. Okay. Some other place, and it's characteristic of some parts of other countries where a country has a part where there is a middle class, and there are some examples and so forth, and the distinction between them. And are the principles that you're trying to get to relevant only to, let's say, a certain part of the world, or are they relevant to the whole of the world in a systems way, including the United States, perhaps?
Right. The relevant part was numbers. The United States was the only place in the world during this period where we had a very, very large middle class. What you're talking about and what you said is that there were equivalents all over the world, but small in number, where most of the population were poor. These extremes of poor and rich, what we were able to do in the United States was to expand the opportunities and create this large middle class.
Is that a thing from the birth of our nation? Is it something after the Second World War? It's something after the Second World War. Thank you.
That came out of the Depression and the Second World War. And I want to emphasize that was very strong in this historically was the development of labor unions. Labor unions pushing for collective bargaining to be able to get increased wages for workers. And even though everybody wasn't a member of a union, the union set the tone, and the government, coming out of World War II, when they were trying to make sure there would be labor peace to produce the goods necessary for the war effort, what they did was support the unions and control, for one of the first times in history, corporate capitalism. They were able
post-Civil War, post-Second War?
Post-Second. This is coming out of the Depression into World War II, and in the 20-year period after World War II,
20 to 70,
what you had was the tenor of American society being set by the ability of labor unions to be able to obtain living wages for the population.
Right, we had Taft
to create a large middle class.
Yeah, we had Taft.
We had progressive income taxes. What we had is a whole system that was able to create this. We still had poverty, we still had extreme wealth, but the picture people got of the United States was this large middle class where there were opportunities for people. Okay, now, if we look at what happened, especially since the fall of the Soviet Union, And remember, one of the additional factors in the development of labor unions was the concern of government and management over the spread of the Soviet Union leading into the Cold War, where our labor unions were safe in comparison with the idea of a world revolution. This set up the framework for the development of the American middle class until the 1980s.
I didn't quite get that. If we go over the Soviet Union and that, and they were safe from that. Our unions, I didn't quite get that.
All right.
It seems important.
One of the great fears in the United States was the spread of the Soviet Union.
Oh, socialism.
And socialism and communism. And a communist revolution. This is what the Cold War was all about.
In those periods after
and
the war.
American labor unions were tame. They were not overthrowing the government. What they were doing is negotiating better wages and benefits that often were given by companies. That is, companies gave pension plans, they gave health insurance in lieu of higher wages, all being bargained out.
By the labor union.
By the labor union.
And you had about 35% participation by the workers.
But what this did was set the stage for non-union people, which then led to government and state employees also unionizing. All right. Beginning in
federal and state,
and state,
state, private, public sector,
in addition to private,
right.
Okay, beginning in the 1980s,
Mr. Reagan.
You had Mr. Reagan and the conservative backlash, and remember, Ronald Reagan's great turning point in the United States that Governor Walker of Wisconsin mentioned yesterday as his turning point was breaking the air traffickers, the air controllers union. To begin to break unions. And this has been a conservative process up to the present, where if you look at what's happening in Wisconsin, what the goal of the right-wing new Republican government is to break the unions. We have already had on all levels the erosion of union membership,
I think in
the moving of jobs to non-union areas and out of the country. And one of the important things to understand about what's happened in the United States in the last couple of decades, what we've done is move most of the factory jobs that were the basis of union work out of the country. The areas of cheap labor. What this did was transform the American economy so that today we have something like 120 million people who are classified as working in service industries and like 18 million in manufacturing and the rest in agriculture. Service was an empty category that we use traditionally to separate manufacturing from agriculture, and what we have done is move agriculture overseas, and this led to the breakdown in unions, and it made it possible for management to destroy unions and suppress wages. As we know, in the last decade or so, the great wealth being produced in the United States has been going primarily to the top 1/10 of 1% or 1%
100th of 1% in real terms.
Extend it. And the average wage has dropped. It's been stable or dropped realistically, in spite of the fact that productivity has increased.
That's a term I'd like to key in on, productivity. It's almost always linked to labor productivity. A couple of things, PAPCO and that, and also my granddaddy was a labor organizer in Detroit, but that it went from, 35, 40% of the workforce, private and private sector, were unionized, Solidarity Forever, and there was a lot of support for it, you know, Lane Kirk, and I think that's gone down to about 6% now in the private sector.
It's dropped
and
significantly.
it's also been, we didn't have the technology of containerization and effective globalization that was made possible by the technological developments and also communications that made it possible for people to not just be limited to one geographical area here or elsewhere, and so they could set up shop where they could race to the bottom, as some people say, and take advantage of slave labor or near slave labor, and also violation of environmental protection. And so since they were globalizing and we have these free trade things, people can't move so adroitly. And so you had those things all developing to create this condition in the United States of America. And then you had a further one. I'd bring it up just as an addendum. We've got to I want to get back to the book.
Okay.
Anyway, I forgot to bring it on the set, but we have also had a general displacement. I'm just suggesting we could key off these. We've had a general trend in the United States and world. The United States, you have figures for and so forth. But in general, since, say, Tom Jefferson's time, it's moved very rapidly from where maybe in terms of, and you use the word productivity. Productivity is almost always in the thinking tied to labor's productivity because
capital.
Well, capital is usually not called that. In fact, somebody we both know, Louis Kelso, wanted to make that distinction. It's productiveness rather than productivity, because productivity is linked to labor. And labor would use those arguments in order to argue for better wages. And Mr. Obama wants those people that have a great deal of money to create jobs as a way of distributing buying power and income to the masses of the people. But it's all part of, and the other thing I just will quickly mention, and you can key off them and we talk to it, but I brought the article that Ray Kurzweil had written in the Wall Street Journal, and it was, I don't have it with me now, but where have all the jobs gone? And what's happening, and he will tell us, and others have, that popular show, Jeopardy! Watson, which was a computer system that outdid the champions of the world in terms of being able to answer very carefully worded questions and so forth, that tested the ability to deal with language in even nuanced ways and everything. Was going, and the thing is that they are moving with cybernetic exponential increasing. What they're doing is the means of production has shifted from labor intensive. We had a whole continent, and 10% maybe was produced other than labor. Labor was very important. But now it's going to where in the reality of the world, particularly in the United States, it's maybe 80, 90% of the actual production is not produced by labor. It's produced by capital instruments, and the capital instruments are all owned by a tiny plutocratic class in the United States and in every political entity everywhere in the world. And in the international order is the way it's always been. But the technology is displacing labor en masse. Even for the professions, it's going to be displacing. So all of those are features of the current situation. So all they talk about in terms of distributing any buying power or participation to the people are jobs. There's not going to be jobs, or it's not going to be where the agriculture workers are going to go into Henry Ford's factory and be needed. They're going to be replacing jobs, even lawyers, and a good deal of the medical business is going to be done by cybernetic. So you've got all of these things, and the only way any society seems to be able to distribute income to the masses of the people is through labor, and it's out of date. But that's just a couple of thoughts. Maybe we can key on.
And the point is that when I said most of the population in the United States is in services, and these are very strongly financial services, because the great wealth that was earned in the United States in the last decade or two has been in financial services.
Yeah.
And you're right in saying to produce things, we need considerably less labor.
Oh, yeah.
And what we are doing, because, as you said, the efficiency of computers and transportation, and this raises the question of the amount of fossil fuels we expend moving goods around, and this is one of the areas where great wealth has been made. If you think of Walmart and the like, what they are able to do.
Supply chain.
What you do is shift labor needs to parts of the world where it is very inexpensive. Remember, this word efficiency we use that unfortunately a liberal president has been using really means to get more productivity with lower labor costs.
And you can also
what
avoid
efficiency means.
and also avoid environmental considerations.
That's right.
And so, and if one country begins to start thinking it's worthy, they're going to try and give their people a living wage, you can go to another country where the people will sell out their population.
And
that's what's
easier
going
to
on.
do the production. And as a result of this, the point I'm trying to make is the comparison
And back to
that the people throughout the Middle East and in many other parts of the world have an imagery of the United States and the tremendous migration problem that we have of people coming to the United States is an imagery that is a generation old, where there are opportunities for this middle class life that's disappearing in the United States.
I think it's going to disappear in the United States, and I think the United States is in for that revolution going across North Africa and so forth is going to come here.
Wait a second.
Okay.
Wait a second.
Yeah, okay.
Because what you're getting is the tremendous dissatisfaction of Americans. The majority who are facing a future where their children are going to have fewer opportunities, and we're looking at downward mobility.
Given the context in which we operate.
I want to look at that for a moment in terms of American politics.
Okay.
Because here we are in a situation where people are dissatisfied en masse. And what is being offered to them politically? We have Democrats who are offering a return to the New Deal of the 1930s.
You think
for the bailouts. This is what Obama's first stimulus plan.
Well, it wasn't only Obama; it was also George Bush at the end of his term they had to save the system, and I think they had to do that.
Not there. No, it's not saving the system. I'm talking just about the stimulus program to expand jobs and opportunities. What this was going back to the New Deal, using Keynesian economics and trying to stimulate jobs. The Democrats then are going back 70 years for their ideas on what to do to satisfy this mass dissatisfaction.
But with all due respect,
stop for a moment.
Okay.
What are the Republicans offering? Ronald Reagan is their hero, and he wanted to break the unions and go back to the period before the New Deal and play it over.
Before the New Deal.
Before the New Deal.
Harding or something.
To the Roaring '20s, where again you had the great disparities of wealth. With the poor and the rich, and without this middle class that people all over the world are looking to the United States as their great hope that doesn't exist here any longer. But one more step in here, because what are the teabaggers doing? They're going back to the 1780s and 1790s with their glorification of the Constitution and the period of the Constitution, and what they are offering the public is going back over 200 years to replay the entire United States history.
Right. Well, okay.
What this means
Yeah.
is that as we sit here, politically and economically, nobody's thinking about the future. You're talking about the technological and other changes going on in the world, and in the midst of all of this world dynamic and dissatisfaction of people complaining and looking for something new, we are being offered back to the 1930s, back to the 1920s, or back to the 1790s.
Or back,
this is what is being offered.
Well, okay, yes, I would say, if you don't mind, Keynes, I would call attention to Keynes. He wrote that letter to his grandchildren. I'm not sure if you're familiar. Keynes was famous for setting up everything, much of the thing out of the Depression, and also but he wrote a letter to his grandchildren. He said, in their maturity, which would be right about now, you're going to be confronted with something that's really hard to imagine from this position. You're going to be confronted with massive, technologically induced unemployment. The means of production are going to become done where, like, for instance, if you get an algorithm that can do what 500,000 workers were needed to do, then you don't need the 500,000 workers. And if you have a free market and an ability to get to other places in the world where you can do it, the people who have tremendous access to capital are not going to be constrained to give a living wage when they can get a lot better profit margin by going adroitly with their capital formation. And that you have that problem. And so the problem then might be one of addressing the word itself that you use trippingly. It's easy to do, productivity. Everything is tied to the idea that wealth or value is the result, or in many, particularly people on the Democratic left or something, tied into human work. The capital assets are
labor theory of value.
It is the labor theory of value, surplus labor theory of value in Marx's term.
Okay.
And it was very, you know, and they say that everything's created by human wealth. It's just capital is just congealed labor. It's all labor, and they're celebrating labor. Gave them a bargaining thing in a socialist camp, and also gave a bargaining to get better than a living wage is something, you know, solidarity forever, and the unions and all of that. But the thing is that this thing that's going on is technological and seems to have a logic of its own, apart from a good deal of what's going on. When you have the capital instruments, I don't know, a metaphor of a combine, which can produce 500 billion barrels of bushels of wheat, and there isn't even anybody driving the damn thing. It's just a piece of technology, or there's many more like that, and there's many more, and the trend is all in that direction.
The steel mill is the better example.
A steel mill
where you can walk through a steel mill and not see a person for a length of a great area you walk, because it's all done by machine.
It's being done where you don't need people.
That's right.
And that's and it's coming out of the cybernetic development, and also the people who had images of the middle class America. I don't know if that's Father Knows Best or something television thing, was global communication that was developing, creating these aspirations. But in all cases, the international order, and in every political order in the world, it seems to me, I thought, with one possible exception, the country of Libya, which has just imploded to the distress of this citizen tremendously. That was the only country I saw that maybe was trying to deal with this question in a historical leading kind of way. We could get to that maybe. But anyway, is it all, they just assume, everybody assumes, that it's perfectly all right for all the capital instruments that are creating the wealth to be concentrated in the hands of those who were already wealthy and are getting wealthier as they sleep, because they have ownership and a claim upon income that the technology that they own is a small plutocratic class in every political entity. And all we do is have our leaders say, we're going to try and create some jobs for the people, if they would only please start creating jobs. But if they can produce things without the jobs, why would they do it? And so it used to be you had to have the people.
Okay.
You don't have to have the people.
Right.
That's a different reality in the world that is not being faced by our intellectual leaders.
Okay.
And that there's not leadership coming from the intellectuals. They're enthralled to Keynes or to other kinds of things that are not relevant to that future that's dawning.
If I may,
Sure.
Keynes was right about his letter to his grandchildren, as you just summarized it. And I will add, just as a needle to you, you were wrong about Gaddafi.
I would like to talk about. I would like to
hold
talk.
it for a minute.
Let's not lose track of that. I'd like to talk about it.
Okay, I want
because
to
it
get
becomes
back.
philosophical.
I want to get back to that philosophical issue.
Yeah, it's important.
But
I think.
again, emphasize that we are dealing with a world marked by dissatisfaction of people who do not have available to them any image of where to go in the future.
We don't have
We
it.
are looking at the Middle East, again, if you use Egypt, where the successful bringing down Mubarak, and they're sitting and saying, who's
Now
going
what?
to set up an electoral government?
Yeah.
And somehow the pundits believe that this is all that's necessary, set up elections. This is what George Bush was pushing.
Yeah.
And this is not the issue, because they are assuming this neoliberal economic system
Much
that
less
we're
than-
seeing is not working in the United States for most of the population.
I don't think-
is going to work elsewhere in the world. Just stop for a moment and let me add for you that whereas the politicians, the right-wing politicians in Wisconsin, Ohio,
Now,
Indiana,
as
and
we talk,
elsewhere now are using budget shortages to break unions. Budget shortages have been imposed worldwide by the IMF. They're called structural adjustment programs. And again, if we go back to the importance of Egypt, they had a structural adjustment program, which means that the programs that government tried to set up to help the large segment of the poor were cut back because of budget constraints.
Right.
It is the same argument being used by conservatives at the national level in the United States and at the state levels that was created by the economic crash brought about by the stopping of regulations of the financial industry, the Glass-Steagall, and a whole series of other things that led to the great crash that we had in 2008. And what followed this, what again you touched on, is the ability to have an economic recovery without jobs. Proving your point that we have created the ability to produce more than ever before and create wealth greater than ever before without creating jobs. But this is what is being promised
to those people in the book
who are unhappy throughout the world and are protesting and bringing down governments, and nobody is providing them with an alternative for the future. And my question to be raised is, what is going to happen when these people realize that they're going to be looking forward to a world in which they're going to live like these Barbadians in the 1950s, where there were no jobs other than the equivalent of what they had, cutting sugar cane for peanuts a day. And these were the only opportunities they had to earn income, and many of them couldn't find jobs. And what is life going to become like? And it is certainly not going to be what we in the United States sold to people all over the world in our television programs and our media and movies, that people are reacting to and protesting throughout the world to get a better life.
Right.
And what I'm saying is that this adds to the difficulties of the future that we're looking at, because the only thing that's going to hold it in check would be the Gaddafis or the Saddam Husseins who kept it in check in Iraq until our invasion. But it was the authority, strong authority with strong police forces that kept people down. All right, the lid is blowing off now. What is available for a future for people all over the world when we know very clearly you cannot distribute this great wealth being produced through jobs, because you don't need this number of jobs, because the governor of Wisconsin and governors throughout the country, and as the president indicated, he can fire federal employees because basically we don't need them. And there's the other invidious thing, because in the image of neoliberal economics, you can outsource it to private companies to create opportunities for entrepreneurs who will hire non-union workers to do the same job at half the pay.
So it's going to begin to look like I Am Legend Will Smith. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie where it's just a wasteland. And that's the thing that you can see very easily coming. And so then one of the questions asked is, I don't know where the people would get an idea of what's going to be done to involve things, because labor still does matter. You need garbage, there's this. And the idea, as we trippingly say, in Mr. Keynes, and it's a trend, and it's probably more a trend in the advanced economies like the United States, but it is the world trend. And the the technological displacement is going to come without replacement places for the labor. But every political entity, all they say is, we're going to create jobs. They don't say we're going to reinvestigate the input mix of capital, and we're not going to investigate in any paradigm kind of way the assumptions by which we're going to operate an economy which is tremendously productive. But it doesn't do you any good to be able to produce a great deal if you don't have people with the buying power to clear the market. It's a supply and demand. So if we can't get demand into the hands of the people through what the Marxists would call wage slavery, even when they've been able to bargain up, they're probably going to have to bargain down, as that, that system of wage distribution, reifying on the left, the labor theory of value, and all of these kind of thinking about how wonderful labor is, and people get their identity from that. You're dealing with things that get their identity. Also, no matter what happens, you're going to have some, in terms of an alternative, you're going to have something that's going to anchor us to history. It's a qualitative, transformative moment, but you do not have any. The one that's falling down on the job are the intellectuals. The intellectuals in the world, and it may be.
Second, Harold.
Let me just finish. I'm almost finished.
Okay.
It's the intellectuals in the world that you would look to for some sort of new thinking, new systems thinking, rather than having a tenured position somewhere in some specialization. They have divided and conquered the intellectual community through the academic process, where you become so specialized that you'll never think about anything in a systems way, because the computer linear regression just created specialization. It's like divide and conquer they used to do of the intellectual enterprise. So the intellectual community writ large is not coming up with any systems, paradigm understandings of what's going on, so that you can get a systems overview of what's going on in a large context. And that's the main problem. The problem is the intellectuals. They're falling down on the jobs because they're too interested in writing another book on some specialized thing that's going to give them a tenured position at a university. And the university is going to be attacked because there's going to be alternative ways of dealing with the store of human knowledge and passing on through cybernated and multimedia presentations to people that are going to be cybernated.
Okay. If I may.
Okay.
One of the things that happened in the development of this model since the Industrial Revolution, coming out of classical economics, of the emphasis on labor. People have come culturally to identify themselves in terms of jobs.
Well,
Their very being. I mean, as we know, with
work,
the unemployment situation, work, people who are unemployed have nothing to do with themselves. They break down psychologically. They have no way of identifying themselves. The problem of retirement is people don't know what to do, so they try to keep on working desperately.
Well, wait a minute. If people are, if they're retired, it makes a difference if you're not working. What you're really saying, or what the real in terms of the economic order, the problem is the demand to clear the market is not going to be there. But if you're retired and you are comfortably leisured retired, is different than being retired. If you're unemployed, you're poor. That's the thing. It's the distribution of buying power.
When you have a culture that defines people in terms of the work they do.
The work ethic.
And there is no work for them.
You got problems.
What I'm saying, this is more than economics. This is social, this is cultural, this is psychological.
You're an anthropologist.
What we have to do
identity's wrapped up in
when we talk about this, what we have to do, you like ideas. You say, we know there are ideas that will solve the economic problem, but what we have to do is deal with an entire cultural transformation that is not even beginning. And what I'm trying to get us back to is saying, look at what the consequences are of people looking for the hope of this system that's breaking down, and people's very beings, their identities are being destroyed because they're looking for jobs, promised jobs. There are no jobs, and we are dealing with political institutions that want to go back to something that doesn't bring in the only opportunity in history. The United States, from roughly the beginnings of the World War II, or after the New Deal program, up to the 1970s, that created a middle class. And it did it in a specific way that no longer possible today. Just throwing out an idea is not enough. It is also understanding what the consequences of trying to change something, because the politicians who are doing this are holding on to this idea that unless you promise something to people that will satisfy all of these cultural needs and desires, you're not going to get elected. So just throwing out an idea is not sufficient. What you have to do is ask intellectuals, and there are some who are coming up with new ideas. But what they're not doing, just a second, what they're not doing is providing a process that we can go through that can get us from here to there. The ideas that you mentioned that you're very familiar with is Louis Kelso and a different system of distributing wealth.
Not necessarily Louis Kelso. You have to have an alternative. And also, it's a little bit limiting to think it like that, because what we're at, in my way of thinking, it's comprehensive. One of the best things I can see, I would say more like, there are others and so forth, but somebody like Bucky Fuller was a comprehensivist. And a comprehensive, and he was looking for an operating manual for Spaceship Earth. And if you have that is that we have a comprehensive understanding of what's going on. And that isn't enough to talk about Taft-Hartley and labor's this and that and the politics, because that's going on at a level of the evolution. I would suggest it's a moment of qualitative transformation in the evolution of universal consciousness. There are signals that the water has broken or is about to break in the gestation of consciousness and universe. We're coming to the end of of the human experience. We've come to a point where technology, extended of our mental processes, now have developed weapons that are species lethal. I do believe the modeling is correct on that. The adverse side of that, which would be part of an understanding of things, if you're getting at it synergetically and in touch with a comprehensive understanding of evolution, it's thermodynamic in universe, is that as far as the human scenario part of that Gaia or evolutionary process, we have transcended since about, in both cases, about the year 1970, the period that you call for the end of this period. Material scarcity is an ontologic reality if we fully understand the productive capability that we have to take care of everybody and the ecology in a way that is not characteristic of all of 200,000 years of human tenure on Earth. We've qualitatively transformed at the level of ability, the ability to deal with things by technological capability. And so that is something that is never mentioned, that we have transcended scarcity. All of our institutions were formulated within a context, appropriately, of scarcity. Thank goodness we were inept or impotent in destructive capability. At the Second World War, we were impotent at being able to contemplate what now we're capable of. Species lethal weapon systems are still there. So that's a context that is beginning to think in terms of us as an evolutionary process in universe, thermodynamic universe, gets confusing, it's synergetic. We're not thinking, so we get to that point. Right. So what we're coming to, let me just finish, almost finished. The metaphor is like we're in a birth canal, and we've been going for 200,000 years. There's evidence that this is Isaac Asimov, this is the defining moment. This is the defining thing. Qualitative transformation and evolution, it's new, and that it's synergetic, and synergy, the behavioral systems unpredicted by the sum of its parts. These are all ideas. These are a level of idea. And then it is that we're coming to a point which we can, if you're in the womb and you're coming into a new context, you can't know that from within the womb, because it's the behavior of systems, a resonancy beyond a resonancy that interaccommodates systems. It's a resonancy of a liberated, it's the promise of liberation, and that liberation would create a resonancy that will interaccommodate us to universe at a level transcendent to human to human history. We're going to come into a new relationship to the universe if we make it. And that's the test. And we don't have comprehensive systems thinking by intellectuals, and that's at the level of idea. It's not at the level of trying to reify some political thing that can be done where we do have to anchor it to history, but where the vision is needed is a synergistic understanding of what the frig's going on in universe. And one of the things I said, I don't know why there's is there a strong anti-intellectual bias among all the people, or for some reason? But it brings us back to that idea of Muammar Gaddafi.
If I may, for a moment.
Okay.
If I may get in a moment.
Okay.
I will sit with you, and we can talk philosophically up on our cloud and go through all kinds of interesting possibilities. And the intellectuals you're talking about tend to do this. I started talking about people and their behavior and what are the consequences of the systems that are built on the behavior of individuals. And what I'm trying to do is to take these abstract ideas that intellectuals come up with and ask, how can they be articulated into the social processes that human beings are enmeshed in, and in terms of how they live? Now,
Well,
you can, what
okay,
we
yeah.
do.
That's the practical.
What we do.
That's the practical
no,
application.
The intellectuals that you're calling for are spinning off all kinds of possibilities.
Like what?
Like the people you have just mentioned. What I'm trying to do is to say it is very difficult to take the ideas that we spin off and bring them back to reality unless you have the kind of funding sources that the conservative right has had, that they have used to mold public opinion in the United States, so that people are actually at the point of believing that there's something better in the future for them if they go back and replay the history of the United States before labor unions, before the New Deal, at the time of writing the Constitution. And do not miss out on the fact that the right wing has their think tanks, the Heritage Foundation, and a whole series of others that they have used to get these abstract ideas. And then they have the Rush Limbaughs and the Glenn Becks
Fox
and the
News.
like, and Fox News deliberately organized to spin off and split public workers from private workers. Oh, he's got more than I have. And you convince individuals of this. These are the social processes, and the intellectuals on the left are missing out on what is being done that has moved the United States and the world from a society that was creating a middle class with greater opportunities to a shrinking of this, and going back because technology has caught up with us, and you really can't create jobs, especially when you break unions and collective bargaining.
Why?
You cannot create jobs that distribute sufficient wealth to create a middle class.
If we can't,
you will only have the extreme rich that we are getting in the United States and the extreme poor who have never gone away. It has not always been.
I don't know when there was any
figured
gold
out
in there.
a way in the United States to do it. We created, realistically, a middle-class society.
For a brief shining moment.
Until it was taken away. And the issue that I'm trying to raise and trying to focus on, because if I go back to the 1950s, what we had was almost a vision of what life in the United States will be like in 5-10 years from now, when, like the Barbadians, there were very few opportunities. People had to work for very, very low wages, and they had to do all of the things, and it had destructive effects on individualism, with increasing depression, with increasing loss of identity, and breakdown of the families that becomes a consequence of this. As I said at the beginning, what happened in Barbados in the 1950s was almost forecasting what's the process that's going on today. And fortunately for many Barbadians, they had the opportunity to immigrate to the United States in the good times, and they were able to create lives, and they still live here in New York. But they too are facing a future, and unless we begin to think, and our political leaders begin to think, of something beyond replaying American history and forcing it on the world, we are all looking for deep trouble. And this becomes a very pessimistic note, because if you remember the last time things like this happened on a world level were in Europe in the 1930s.
Yeah, that's all good and everything. That's part of history and everything, but it's very, it's not addressing...
It is addressing the problem, because look what happened in the 1930s.
Well, that's...
People invented all kind of possibilities, like communism, Nazi organization, German socialism. Mussolini's socialism, all of these things became the background.
History is
and
a nightmare.
Human beings invent things when they are frustrated, and this is what we are looking at happening today. And what I'm saying again is, you and I can sit and debate this philosophically. That's not going to resolve
Not
anything.
philosophically. No,
Because it's only done philosophically. What you're doing in transcending history, or however you put it, is looking at grand
It's
ideas.
systems thinking is looking for an operating manual for Spaceship Earth, and going into great details about one aspect of history or this group or that is something that academia is really good at. That's the way they divide it. Where are the systems thinkers? Buckminster Fuller was one, looking for an operating manual, putting things together in a way, and my suggestion that we're thinking too small. The intellectual community has been...
When did Buckminster Fuller live and write?
He died in 1983.
When did he write?
He wrote throughout his period from the 20. Well, he was born in 1985 or 95.
And Buckminster Fuller's writings are to be found in libraries.
Okay,
today.
and one thing that
bring me back to reality, and let's talk about how ideas become part of the world of people acting and behaving and living in a daily world.
But that would be
This is the issue that I'm trying to direct us back to and say to you and to all of my friends who are concerned with ideas that until you start thinking in terms of social processes in addition to grand systems, we lose out on any possibility of providing solutions for the issues that seem to be facing the people who are out demonstrating in the streets
at the moment,
desperately trying to avoid their world collapsing around them.
Right, and what's going to happen if we keep thinking that way without the ideas? Without vision, we're lost. And we're saying in a certain sense that we can just endlessly divide it up into specific things rather than trying to find overarching vision.
Harold, excuse me, that's not what I did today. What I have been doing is trying to provide relationships between things and looking in terms of systems that exist. And what I'm saying to you is the solutions that we may come up with have to be related to the social and economic and political systems. And what this means, I'll go back to, is starting to rethink the Enlightenment principles that far too many intellectuals also are wedded to, with all of their implications. And what this says is, remember, the right wing is not going to support intellectuals who come up with ideas that don't lead right back to neoliberal economics and going back to the 20s and maybe 1790s.
Well, Sid, you got your say, you got it in the book. It's called English Rustic and Backskin. It's a very good critique and observation of things. I think it's kind of narrow, but that's my thing. I think it's not what we need, but I think it's more important. I would have liked to gotten into some reasons of why Muammar Gaddafi was so loved by so many people at the level of idea. Wasn't able to translate it into reality. It's an idea that wasn't able to be translated into reality. We have this awful situation now there. But it's a moment of qualitative transformation. And I thank you, Sidney. It's so good to see you.
Maybe the next Gaddafi will listen to what I just said.
No, I think his idea is still...
this is how...
No, he's still...
This is how you relate ideas to social organizations.
He's still important at the level of ideas. He had a system that maybe was able to transcend the overall paradigm running this world based upon the American model of what should be, all of this thinking going on, and was coming up with ideas that were going to be relevant to the way the world's going to have to be organized, rather than just worrying about reifying various takes on it and so forth. That's the problem. He had a vision that was really important. Apparently, it got lost in terms of the implementation, how we get the right ideas, what they are, comes first. The design comes first. Then you can do about the presentation. But without, we don't need the, in my view, that's my take on it. And he'll be relevant in that in the long, no matter what. How many people go at this end where it's over.
Do not try to convince the people that Glenn Beck and Rush Limbaugh have been
No, you're going to have to include
wait a
them.
second. Do not try to convince them with abstract ideas. Begin to understand how you get down to their level, because we still live in an electoral system.